Keeping that in mind, we have started today's lecture and organized it, inviting Dr. Lisa Trivedi from New York to present this lecture. She has done a BA in History and Political Science from Hampshire College, MA in History from University of Chicago, and then PhD in History from University of California. She has been teaching at Hamilton College since 2000. She is a social and cultural historian of modern India. Some of her publications are The Status of Women, Public Health in Global World, Maternal Mortality in Bombay and Manchester, Refocusing the Lens, Pranlal K. Patel's Photographs of Women at Workplace in Ahmedabad, Clothing Gandhi's Nation, Homespun and Modern India, Exhibitions and Media Coverage, Refocusing the Lens, Pranlal K. Patel's Photographs of Women at Work in Ahmedabad. We are going to again see this work today in a more detailed and enlightening light. With this, I invite her to join us. Please come. And give our presentation. Thank you.
I'm so honored to be able to speak with you today, particularly on the occasion of, or in celebration of Women's Day yesterday. And I had a big surprise. I was working in the state archives in Elphinstone College yesterday afternoon, and suddenly one of the archivists called all the women working there, the women like myself, scholars doing research, and right there we were presented with flowers, with chocolate, and with a pen. And I thought, I've never experienced Women's Day. I guess I've never been celebrated on a Women's Day before, so this is a very exciting occasion for me. Before I arrived in Mumbai a couple of weeks ago, I was fortunate to see an exhibition in Ahmedabad at the Shanti Sadan called Changemakers, The Extraordinary Lives of Ordinary Women in the Bombay Presidency. I'm wondering if some of you, because this originated here at the museum, I'm wondering if some of you might have seen that exhibition earlier. If you did, you may see that today's talk will touch upon some of the themes that curator was also trying to bring to the fore. And before I get started, since we're talking about women's history today, I want to share a little bit about my own historical interests. For a long time, my interest in history was really driven by the history and interest in the history of women and of gender. And about 30 years ago, when I started graduate school, believe it or not, I was discouraged. I was discouraged from taking this particular subject. Not entirely for bad reasons, I would say. The reality is that the nature of most archival materials upon which historical scholarship is based rarely talks about women directly. And so I was actually being warned that when you walk into the archive, if your interest is women, you're not likely to find files that explicitly identify that content. There are obviously other marginalized parts of the population in India and really globally for which that would also be true. So my interest was redirected to Gandhi's Swadeshi movement, which not only deepened my interest in women and their role in the movement, but it allowed me to develop skills in reading visually. This enabled me further to complete a study of a Gandhian movement that was not so much focused on Gandhi, but how his ideas were taken up and actually transformed by many ordinary people in this country, including women. So today's talk builds upon methods related to the study of visual materials and noticeably will challenge some of the disciplinary standards of historical practice, opening up, I hope, questions from which not only those who are historically minded, but a broader public might engage. Now, I had some slides that I was trying to rotate slowly before the talk for you to see. I'm wondering how many of you actually took a look. Just raise your hand if you looked at the slides that were up earlier. Okay, good. So, any of you who took a look, what did you see? What did you notice about those slides? Somebody stand up and bravely tell me what you noticed. Images look familiar to you? So you could see women in the images. Did some of those images seem like you might see those women today? In fact, in many cases, if you go to Ahmedabad today and you look in the market or on the thoroughfares that are pictured, those women are still there today. So I just wanted you to notice that a little bit, in part because what I think I will show you today in Pranlal Patel's photographs is how this visibility is available to you today as a spectator of his photographs from 1937. And this should help us to evaluate the historical archive as well as lead us to new questions and hopefully new sources that can focus our attention on marginalized communities like women. Approximately 100 photographs of women at work in the Bombay Presidency's second city, Ahmedabad, were taken in 1937 by photographer Pranlal K. Patel. Then a primary school teacher, Patel was commissioned to undertake the project by the city's leading women's social reform organization, the Jyoti Sangh. The photographs were not publicly seen, however, for 7 decades after their creation, when several were displayed in the refurbished head offices of the Self-Employed Women's Association, and later in an exhibition about the Jyoti Sangh in their renovated headquarters. Why the photographs were not seen for 70 years, nearly 70 years, is a question that warrants our consideration. So in this talk, I'm going to look beyond the visual expectations of the Jyoti Sangh to suggest that Patel's photographs today can illustrate a story that society at the time was unprepared to tell about women at work. Long after their creation, Patel's series offers traces of what Roland Barthes called, what was really there, enabling us to recognize the limitations, as I just said, of historical archives. Pranlal Patel's Jyoti Sangh series is extraordinary for a variety of reasons. I won't rehash all of them now, happy to engage in that a little bit later. But I will say that they're extraordinary in terms of the history of early 20th century photography in India, in part because the colonial state itself did not engage in a project to systematically record women's work or even the work of those in the informal areas of the economy. This was the period of the US Farm Security Administration's documentation of the Great Depression. In the Soviet Union, there was state-supervised photojournalism undertaken specifically to glorify and recognize workers in that new country. Patel's background and training in photography depart from Indian photographers who are generally featured in scholarly literature, who are more often connected to the courts of princely India, they were officials in the colonial administration, or trained by artistic families of some renown. An orphan, Patel migrated to Ahmedabad with his maternal uncle, who provided him with an education that enabled him eventually to become a primary school teacher. He received no formal arts education. His introduction to the medium of photography grew out of a hobby, cultivated in part in the 1930s by participation in Niharika, Ahmedabad's amateur photography club. And here he is, he's the figure on the far right, standing with his club of photographers. Patel's photographic gaze drew upon his own experiences as a migrant and informal laborer in the city. In fact, as a teenager, he did a variety of odd jobs, selling newspapers and snacks. They offer an opportunity to explore, therefore, the practices of India's amateur photographers, who have rarely been the focus of scholarship. Perhaps because of his common background and unorthodox training, Patel's photographs capture a range of women's labor that are rarely seen in the official records or commercial photography of this period. As Elizabeth Edwards has observed, historical photographs can unsettle historical narratives grounded in textual archival materials favored by historians in their representations of the past, while, quote, creating a historical think space where they can reveal and activate specific ways of having been in the world. The series offers a view of women's economic roles that contrasts, as I've been saying, with archival records by focusing not just on women, right? There were women working in the formal sectors of the economy in Ahmedabad's industrial textile mills. About 25% of those workers were women. But because he is focused, for the most part, in this series on the much greater number of women workers who worked in the informal sector, his vernacular gaze landed on women workers in this sector of the economy, depicting women's contributions not as peripheral to the economic life of the city or isolated from the public. Instead, he pictures women as laborers across the city's major marketplaces and as integral to the city's industrial productivity. Although photographs are among the most important although photographs are among the most important visual material objects of the modern era, historians have approached them with considerable unease. Determining a photograph's meaning has been a problem raised by photographers, art critics, and theorists nearly since the beginning of photography itself. If the nature of meaning has been a question that has vexed commentators on photography, theorists have achieved consensus that photographs do not simply reflect the world that created them, but rather they actively construct a world they purport to represent through inscription. Elizabeth Edwards observes, quote, not only do they inscribe past moments on surfaces, they disturb the surface of the documentation of the past. Placing emphasis not only on what photography says, but also on what it does, another scholar named Ariella Azoulay has examined the role of photography in chronicling the past and establishing modern community. In her work, The Civil Contract of Photography, which I highly recommend, it's a very interesting book written by a scholar of comparative literature, Azoulay insists that photography offered moderns new relationships of power beyond those that actually photographers themselves generally talk about. Beyond the camera, beyond the photographer, beyond the patron, beyond the photographed. At the same time that a photograph lies in someone's hands, she writes, quote, someone else can always claim the deposited image for themselves, or at least demand to participate in its safekeeping. Drawing our attention to the photograph's specter, Azoulay theorizes what she terms the civil contract of photography. And that's what I'm really going to explore with you today, the civil contract of photography, a modern ethics tied to the age of citizens and the photographic image. She suggests that the photograph can enable, quote, injured parties to present their grievances in person or through others, now or in the future. She explores the critical role of spectators, like me, like you, whose engagement with the photograph has the potential to generate new narrative landscapes in which the photographed can be seen at last as a subject. So I'm going to turn now to talk a little bit about Patel's series and how it was created, following the work of Elizabeth Edwards and Ariella Azoulay, to consider the ways in which these historical material objects depict subjects otherwise unseen in the archive. The subject of women's labor, women at work, was not the photographers. The subject was chosen by the Jyoti Sangh, founded by Mridula Sarabhai in April of 1934. Sarabhai was the daughter of a mill owner in the city and the niece of the city's leading labor organizer, Ansuyaban Sarabhai. She had come of age in a city that was closely associated with nationalist politics. Aparna Basu explains that Sarabhai founded the Jyoti Sangh, quote, with the objective of becoming a pathfinder, a light giver for hundreds of women who needed it, and to provide them with sufficient opportunities for their physical and mental development. In Mohandas Gandhi's estimation, the founding of the Jyoti Sangh would, quote, harness the power of Indian women for the development of their nation. So in the fall of 1937, another matron, not the woman who's pictured here unfortunately, named Charumati Yodha, who was a prominent figure in the Jyoti Sangh at that time, she approached Patel about taking photographs of women working in the city. Why? Or to what end? Patel confided he never understood. Nonetheless, the primary school teacher was eager to take up the commission, creating just over 100 photographs over the course of only a few weeks. Roughly a third of these photographs were of the Jyoti Sangh members themselves, engaged in social work, either at their organization's headquarters, which is what you see in this slide, or in the neighborhoods that they served. And I'll just show you a few photographs of the Jyoti Sangh. Here's a store, which was also featured in the last slide, where they were selling things to fundraise, sometimes crafts and snacks produced by women who came into contact with their good works. For college students, I think, ladies, this is kind of an interesting photograph because these are young women, members of the Jyoti Sangh, some of whose mothers were probably the ones that joined the organization initially, being trained in self-defense. Here are Jyoti Sangh ladies also winding the puni. They must have been spinning, following Gandhi's advice to spin half an hour a day for the labor of the nation. A sewing class that women were invited to come to if they wanted to learn some new skills where they could supplement the incomes of their matron who has a very distinctive sari. If you look on the border, it's the symbol of the organization. So it's almost like a uniform, and she's gone out and is engaging with these pottery sellers. Less than 10 of the photographs were of women taken up in new trades in the city, including typewriting, nursing, and telephone operators. The overwhelming number of the photographs, the 60 plus, depicted ordinary women in the city's poles and markets, as well as on its major thoroughfares. So again, here is a great photograph of a woman that Pranlal Patel said he photographed specifically because she was the only female owner of a store in the city center that he knew of. By 1937, the use of photography like this, as the Jyoti Sangh was commissioning, was used as a means of raising awareness by social reform organizations across the globe. In the US, Jacob Riis, a Danish-born American photographer, famously began chronicling New York City's immigrant communities, drawing the attention of the public and government officials to the appalling living conditions of the urban poor and mobilizing civic action. Women's organizations in the United States and Great Britain were making use of photography not only to raise awareness of similar conditions in Chicago, Manchester, and London, but also to raise funds for their relief work and to recruit new members to their ranks. As Ariella Uzale explains, the camera opened the possibility of redefining the concept of citizenship and the conditions of its fulfillment. People deprived of citizenship, women first and foremost, began to take active part in the formation of a new world. So it seems likely to me that the Jyoti Sangh was just in step with other women's social reform organizations of this period. Their intention was to enable Ahmedabad's middle and elite classes to see working women as prospective members of a national community, even if these women required reform before they could achieve such belonging. Seeing women whose lives could be reformed by the Jyoti Sangh program also enabled a new national subjectivity, an idea of being an Indian, sought both by women reformers and also the nationalist elite. As the colonial state was focused on demonstrating the development of a modern industrial economy under the British, women and working people who contributed to ancillary services and informal economic activities were rarely addressed, either in written form or in photographic form. In the period of Patel's stories, the British government of India undertook a large study of labor disputes and industrial riots in the Bombay Presidency and in British India as a whole, rather than survey the kinds of work performed or by whom. On the rare occasions when women workers did appear in the official archive in any significance, they did so often as problems of public order or needed policing. If women, the working classes, low or outcast people, were not denigrated in official record keeping, neither were they deemed worthy of recognition. Of the roughly 60 photographs of ordinary women in this series, and I'll show you some of the slides that you saw earlier, 1/3 are portraits of individual women at work. Another 2/3 document 2 or more people working together or in close proximity. While women commonly worked with other women, these portraits also established that women labored alongside men. While roughly half of the photographs in the series capture women at work in a domestic environment, the other half portray women working in the city markets like this woman, or on the major city's thoroughfares. So what we have is an extraordinary range of women's labor that is captured brilliantly by this photographer. Portraiture was his preferred mode of representation, enabling recognition of previously unseen subjects and creating a sense of intimacy between the viewer and her subjects. Patel's technical and aesthetic approaches disrupted colonial and nationalist gaze that was accustomed to seeing working women in a limited way, if at all. So now again, I'm going to show you some of these photographs. Selling neem, sticks. Notice also the bustling market that you can see he's captured in the frame. Used clothing market. And if you know Ahmedabad and you visit Ahmedabad, this market is exactly where it is today in the photograph. Hasn't moved. This is one of my personal favorites. This woman, Patel, said he took the photograph on the spot because she only came into the city once a week to sell milk. Here's a community of women, probably of one family or caste group in, I think it's Joshinipol. An example of the kind of domestic environment that we see. A mother-in-law or sister-in-law, mother and daughters embroidering. I'm now interested in reconstructing what these domestic spaces were like. Jain widows making whisks. This is another one of my favorites. Can you see that there's a moving child in one woman's lap as she's making the jadu? Yeah. Patel's decision to locate the balance of his subjects in these public places placed the Jyoti Sangh's prospective middle-class viewers, spectators, in close proximity, perhaps even intimate proximity, to people they might otherwise not recognize as they moved through some of these spaces. Through technical and aesthetic choices, he disrupted a distinction between reformer and reformed. His series, perhaps because of who it inscribed on negative and paper, also significantly challenged the economic, political, and visual priorities both of colonial and nationalist India. Could it be that Patel's photographs forced a contemporary spectator to see subjects she was not yet entirely prepared to acknowledge? While low-caste women performing menial work might have found a place in the colonial or developing nationalist imaginaries, and therefore been visible to a spectator at the time, Patel presented his subjects neither in need of rescue by the colonial state nor reform by the Jyoti Sangh. Instead, the photographs encouraged and enabled recognition of similarity, if not parity, between the viewer and the viewed. Seeing the woman pictured entailed a 1937 viewer to recognize a shared humanity with the photograph's subject. Now, for communists like Sarabhai and some of her associates in the Jyoti Sangh, this kind of recognition was a matter of closely held political commitment and tied to the very kind of society they were hoping to bring into being. However, for the wider membership of the Jyoti Sangh and the broader readership of the organization's magazine, Jyotipuri, the intimacy created by Patel's photographs may have been too demanding. Perhaps they were not used by the Jyoti Sangh in this period because there was no ready audience for the unsettling subjectivities that the photographs presented. Patel's photographs challenged conventional wisdom about who could make claims to the status of a modern Indian citizen. I wish to draw attention to a couple of kinds of photographs that we see in this collection that demonstrate how his choices around composition and technique shaped what I'm calling a vernacular humanizing gaze that made visible new citizen subjects. The first kind of photograph focused on a woman engaged in a particular kind of work, like this image. The idea behind this group of photographs was to represent both the woman as a person rather than a type through her industriousness in her particular occupation. He communicated this idea not only through his subject's isolation, but also by the way he framed the portrait with physical characteristics of her settings, light, and gradations in shade. Patel's composition produced an intimacy that sets these portraits apart both from the formal portraiture of the period and the ethnographic photography of the colonial regime. The photograph of a woman making baskets for the sweet seller exemplifies the intimacy that Patel offered his prospective spectator, leaving her with questions that suggest connections unpictured. Who provided the materials stacked beside her? To whom would she deliver these wares? The contemporary viewer would notice the unadorned surroundings of the worker. Was this the place the woman laid her head to rest, or where she spent her day at work? Patel photographed his subject without her sari tied, her petticoat wrapped around her legs, exposing one calf, her soiled blouse missing buttons, strains to conceal her ample figure. Although the woman making baskets did not meet Patel's gaze, she doesn't seem uneasy with his presence either. Through her willingness to be photographed, the basket maker connects herself both to the photographer and those who will carry sweets home in her baskets. Does she anticipate future spectators like us, people she will never meet? Reflecting back on his work decades later, Patel did not see his choices as political per se. Rather, he characterized them with a noticeable grin as a form of humanizing recognition. So for him, these were women that he came across as he was working in informal labor himself as a younger man. I'm just going to skip ahead because which you may have seen earlier, situates the woman and her work in a broader social environment. Patel renders working women visible by carefully associating a woman and her work with specific locations in the cityscape. So, for example, there was a photograph I have somehow not managed to follow this one with, of a woman selling chilies in the Manikchak, in the main wholesale municipal market. The municipal market of any city was a site of considerable colonial surveillance. Officials carefully monitored commercial activities of India's markets, recording the kinds of goods sold, their quantity and their price, as a means of establishing the economic health and progress upon which the imperial project depended. Rarely, however, do these records of markets like that of Manikchak provide any detail about the people, men or women, whose labor the commercial activities, upon whom the commercial activities relied. In a photograph of selling chilies in Manikchak, Patel directs his prospective spectators' attention to a young woman who is in the act of weighing chilies. He photographs her in the midst of the workplace. She stands out around produce that almost entirely surrounds her. The market's vitality is apparent not only from that context, but because of a blur of action that Patel included in his image. He further drew the spectator's attention to the market's customers by capturing a shadow of a customer making a purchase. The context in which Patel captured this woman at work emphasizes her relationship to her customer. In the foreground and background, we see other chili sellers, some female, some male, suggesting that the Manikchak was not a gender-segregated commercial space in that period. The photograph of a woman at work in the Manikchak also demonstrates how his vernacular humanizing gaze effectively challenged the archival view of women's labor as domestic, as marginalized, and as peripheral. Through framing, he depicted his subject as active, integral part of a larger social and economic world he shared with his contemporary spectators. Carefully selecting his subjects and locations, Patel shows his spectator how connected his subjects were to the city's life. But remember, there were no spectators for these photographs in 1937. Because the Jyoti Sangh made no use of the photographs, we're left to conclude that his best efforts to represent women at work, that was his commission, did not satisfy them. Even photography, which was seen as an exemplar modern technology of representation and truth, could not overcome the hierarchies that structured the society it inscribed. What would it take for these women at work to be seen? It was several decades before an Ahmedabad labor activist repositioned the Jyoti Sangh series within the consciousness of her city. In post-colonial India, Patel's photographs found a new context that was distinct from that in which they had been created. That context was the movement for the right of women workers under Indian labor law. In 1973, the late Ilaben Butt, a lawyer and founder of the Self-Employed Women's Association, witnessed a devastating accident involving Kanku Rana, a hand-cart puller, whose knees were both broken as she struggled to stop her cart at a traffic intersection in response to a policeman's signal. Looking into the matter in hope of aiding Rana, Butt discovered that India's labor laws did not recognize her as a worker at all, rendering her ineligible for workers' compensation. After a 9-year legal struggle, Butt eventually secured limited compensation for Rana, as well as reconsideration of informal workers in terms of rights to fair pay, access to bank loans, health services, and child care under Indian labor statutes. So more than 30 years after independence, India's labor laws began to change, acknowledging workers like Rana and also the women Patel had photographed decades earlier. but unionized women workers in Ahmedabad, and in doing so made women's informal labor a visible subject of public discussion. Eventually, she approached Patel about his photographs for Seva's newly renovated headquarters. Her display of these photographs was not simply aesthetic or decorative. It was a choice both to recognize the changes Seva had achieved over the course of nearly 30 years, and to normalize also the idea of women as workers, not only within the formal sectors of the economy or among educated professionals, but also for the largely illiterate women Seva served. The organization pursued seeing the work of women laborers by making Patel's women workers visible to their own members, visually laying claim to the status of subject citizen in India's democratic state. Nearly a decade after their display by Seva, selected photographs from the series were presented at another venue in Ahmedabad. A Times of India article announced the rebirth of the Jyoti Sangh in 2009. Many, if not most, of the founding generation had by then passed away. A reconstituted leadership in the city sought to attract a new generation of women to the organization. Working with an architect, Snehal-ben Nagarseth, they designed a welcome and information space that would host public lectures and functions of citywide interest. In fact, Ila-ben herself was, I think, the inaugural lecturer in the opening of the Jyoti Sangh, reopening of the Jyoti Sangh. The Jyoti Sangh presented an exhibition that highlighted the early activities of the organization. After 70 years, the Jyoti Sangh arrived at a narrative that would support their display of the photographs they had commissioned. Patel's photographs, as displayed, however, emphasize something quite different than that expressed by Seva offices, or indeed suggested by Patel's series. The selection and display placed emphasis on the critical role of the organization's members in the life of women in the city. While Patel's portraits had been overwhelmingly of ordinary working women, the Jyoti Sangh's exhibition, perhaps unconsciously, depicted the same women as objects of their social reform and rescue. Jyoti Sangh members were the acting subjects and citizens of the modern India displayed. A spectator might still catch a glimpse of a chilly cellar, as I just described, but she was presented as a type of woman who relied upon and was uplifted by the Jyoti Sangh's own efforts. The Jyoti Sangh, I would argue, found a usable past that served their organization's future. Now, as Elizabeth Edwards makes clear, the context in which we reconstruct and read historical photographs does not end with the period in which they were created. Quote, "Inscription implies a desire for permanence, a settling down, a chance of longevity. History is, we could say, constituted by the past of human life, quietly contained, stored and transported through inscriptions. Photographs are integral to these fundamental practices because not only do they inscribe past moments on the surfaces, but they massively extend the idea of what historical inscriptions might be. They disturb the surface of the documentation of the past." One of the most exciting facets, then, is what Azoulay is pointing to, the possibility of creating ethical spectators in our world. The official records that made it impossible for us to see women at work in 1937 have been transformed, right, by the political environments in which we have been raised and grown up. And that's in part what allows us to see these photographs in a way that Ahmedabad's residents maybe were not prepared in 1937. I unexpectedly came across these photographs when I went searching for photographs of industrial mill workers in the Bombay Presidency. I knew that Pranlal had taken photographs in this period. When I asked him if he had any photographs from of women mill workers, he said that he thought it was quite unlikely. Mills are dark, and he had no flash photography equipment at that time. But he shared this series of photographs with me. These inscriptions of the past have reoriented the economy of Ahmedabad and even what kinds of files I am reading in the archive. The prospect of an exhibition at my college provided Patel with an opportunity to return to 100 subjects he had created decades earlier. It enabled him to exhibit a large part of the series together for the first time. Scanning the pages of a registrar he had kept in the 30s, Patel gave each photograph a title for the first time. Although he had not collected the names of his subjects, he associated each subject with the location in which the photograph was taken and the work that was performed. I probed his memory for additional information as we examined just, off-print after off-print over the course of several days. Sometimes he remembered very specific things about the compositional or technical choices he had made in a particular image. Other times he recalled particular conversations he would have with the woman as he photographed her. The photographer's memory was mediated in part by his own records, but also by my questions. And his memory, perhaps too conveniently, seemed strangely aligning with my own new priorities. The exhibition provided me with an opportunity to make public aspects of women's labor in Ahmedabad, which is not currently covered in the histories of the city or of labor more generally. Neither had the colonial state set out to survey these kinds of economic activity, and truthfully, they probably didn't have the capacity to do a complete survey anyway. But rather than focus on those kinds of records, what these images have taught me is that they can be useful instruments in recalibrating what we focus upon, what kinds of sources we excavate, what kinds of sources we read as we reconstruct the past. Patel's photographs defied a comfortable consensus born of official records, unexamined assumptions about women's work, and the Jyoti Sangh series has enabled me to move beyond what has been called the allure of the archive to reconstruct a more representative, if still incomplete, picture of daily life of ordinary people in this city. As I organized the photographs for the exhibition, I turned to arranging them after I started working with a historical map of this period of the city, and I started plotting the locations of each of the photographs. I recalled a particular image, let me see, this one, a particular image called Carrying Goods. Patel had taken on the edge of the city near the Kalapur railway station, which uncannily corresponded to a photograph taken by a famous Magnum photographer, Henri Cartier-Bresson, some 30 years later. I'll show you that image. The coincidence of images propelled me to make the railway station a starting point for the exhibition, informed as much by the array of Patel's photographs as it was by Cartier-Bresson's ability to see informal labor decades later. It seemed fitting also that the subject who galvanized Butt's legal framework for women had been a cart puller. With the historiographical think space left by inscriptions, I reimagined the city's life through the work of women, beginning each morning with the arrival of food, raw materials, finished goods at Ahmedabad's railway station, goods that made their way through the city's thoroughfares to its major markets to be sold and transported often to homes. These goods sustained the lives of all Ahmedabadis and were touched by the hands of many whose labor remains invisible, not only in colonial state records, but also to middle-class consumers several decades later. His series suggests that no part of the city's material life was untouched by the hands of women, and that modern life in Ahmedabad, as elsewhere, depended upon labor that was female. So I'm going to conclude with just a few ideas to take away. Patel's photographs had languished in boxes of neatly stacked off-prints, stored somewhat haphazardly in his home for decades, due to a double blindness, to the informal work of women and to their critical role in building a modern industrial economy. Post-colonial nationalism, as Manu Goswami has observed, imagined India as a space occupied by a self-sacrificing, modern industrial, laboring male subject whose interests were defined and represented by the state. This view has been reinforced, if not produced, by historians who have relied uncritically on colonial records. What ethical responsibilities do we have to those who photographed, like Pranlal Patel, and those who were photographed, like the women he depicted? The work of the Self-Employed Women's Association rendered the double blindness of traditional historical sources untenable when it exposed gaps in India's otherwise labor-friendly legal frameworks that had rendered women ineligible for state welfare. Appealing to Azoulay's ethics of the spectator as she displayed Patel's photographs for the first time, Ela Ben Butt created a context in which Patel's photographs could speak of subject citizens, marginalized but no longer invisible. This shift constituted a critical new context in which Patel's women workers could be recognized. Photography, Azoulay asserts, enables the photographed subjects, quote, to make politically present the ways in which they have been dominated. The Jyoti Sangh series demonstrates Patel's recognition of the wide range and impact of women at work in 1937, compelling us to consider who we privilege as our historical subjects. Patel's Jyoti Sangh series invites historians to consider how alternative methods of research and reading might render visible a range of marginalized subjects who have previously been obscured by the materials we choose to bring into view. Such a move may not only render our representations of the past a little fuller, but it may allow us to confront the effects of historical representation on forms of systemic inequality today. R. Srinivasan calls upon us, as we engage with the historical photograph, quote, to resist the immediate sense of the image that the image offers us, to address the range of effects that it has upon us, and to work on ways in which it shapes us, so that what emerges from this engagement is a subjectivity that empowers against contemporary oppressions and is provided a chance to fight those that are sure to come. Thank you very much.
My question would be, how do you look at these photographs' role in writing business history? Because there are a lot of people who look at these records. There are a lot of photographs which tell you a different story as to what is written in those texts. So how do you look at these things?
Especially, so I pointed out the one photograph that Patel said he had taken specifically because this was a business owner. He didn't know at the time, had she inherited that shop, you know, was it her husband's shop, had it been her father's shop? He didn't have that kind of information. But I think what I'm doing with the photographs is I would then go to look, okay, what are the shops? What are the revenue records of the shops in that area of the city? And sometimes there are just stray comments. It's not that the colonial official or the local municipal official is trying to comment on women, but sometimes they just appear in the record in those fragmentary spaces. So I guess that's what I would encourage you to do. And I'm not an anthropologist, I'm a historian, but I've also found it's very useful to use some anthropological techniques of participant observation. So, for example, I pointed to the photograph of the used clothing market. I think that's the kind of space that, as a historian, if if you situate yourself and just observe what's going on, it sort of sensitizes you to other kinds of questions that you might ask. So how many clothes were coming in and out of Ahmedabad at that time? There are records of the octroi that was paid, right, whenever something was brought in and out. So then you can start to imagine places in the official colonial records where you might catch other glimpses of women.
Thank you.
Tell me, do these photographs appear in newspapers?
So I actually went looking through Jyoti Puri, which was the Jyoti Sangh's weekly supplement to the Gujarat Samachar, and I didn't have much luck finding many issues where I could check this, but to my knowledge, they were not publicly seen until Ilaben displayed them in the Seva offices.
If you were to look at newspapers in Ahmedabad today, what do you see?
Newspapers in any city, we rarely see photographs still, right, of this segment of the population. And that's what I mean by the historical importance of this is not just about the past, it's about what we are seeing in our world today, what kind of politics and programs we want to have as a society. These are questions being asked in the United States, across Europe, in India. I mean, they're questions that apply everywhere. So I think that's that tension between what we see. We can see these women, but you're noticing maybe I don't see the women today of this society in the newspaper. I see other figures.
That he just photographed. He was never tempted to interview any of these women to find out a little more. Or was it just like a narrative one could build through the photographs?
School teacher. He had a regular full-time job. And so what he told me is very early in the morning he would go out on his bicycle to different locations in the city. And he was trying to capture a range of different work. So he was pretty clear about the locations in the city where certain kinds of labor was performed. He would engage the women that he approached. He had to photograph, he said the light was best in the morning. This is a very basic super icanta camera. And so he had to kind of take images pretty much on the spot. I don't have the sense that he had many long-term conversations with these women. There were some photographs where he said, I found this subject, I wanted to take her photograph, but the light would not permit me at that time. So he might have had longer conversations, and that may be why he remembers more about some of the photographs. But I'm afraid, yeah, he was told the assignment was document women at work, and he did that to the best of his ability. But I don't think he engaged further with the women. And I think this is an interesting question because most of these women would never have been photographed before. They may not have even seen a photograph before. And I just kind of wonder about what they thought they were participating in. There were photographs in newspapers because he was selling other things to newspapers.
Is there another question?
He doesn't photograph people in their homes. I mean, he doesn't really enter the living spaces. Do you think any reason why he didn't really enter the living space? And there's one other question. Which historians are very interested in, as you know. This is a very emphatic narrative of poverty. You know? But all of us are interested in knowing when narratives of poverty also have another narrative added to them, that is a narrative of inequality in a society. Now, a photograph is a terrific way of doing it. Then I just wanted to raise this question. Do you think in the gentleman's imagination, these questions were there? Or because one doesn't really see that in most photographic representations. I don't know about Cartier-Bresson's work. I have not seen most of it. But you know, this is something I find is a great, I mean, something very unfortunate, you know, that even our records, of course, don't document this, you know. So our literatures do, I mean, this classic study of Asa Briggs. But, you know, I mean, this is absolutely incredible, this sort of photography. Have you ever seen the work of Homa Gyarawala, who also did photographs at the same time? She was from Baroda. There's a book by her, on her by Sabina Gadio. You see it? Yeah, maybe.
So I don't think that he was thinking of inequality at all. The inequality piece is what I think we can do with this historical information today in our society. I don't even think, as I said, he wasn't thinking of himself as a feminist. He wasn't thinking of himself as doing something political. I think the way he was approaching the subject was, these are women he kind of knew. He had some experience with, you know, as he was selling newspapers, or he was selling snacks, or he was moving about the city. They were familiar to him. And I think this is a period where the question of representation, 1937 is the first expanded election, right, under the reform of 1935. So I think this question of who's an Indian citizen and who's enfranchised to vote, that might have been in the back of his mind, particularly because he's in Ahmedabad, which is such a center of, you know, nationalist organization. But when I questioned him about it, he just kind of said, you know, these are women I knew, or...
He must be very old now.
He passed away in 2015. No, 2014. He was 105 when he died. And yeah, he had a very long life. And I want to make his photography, this is a small section of the photography that he did. He began photographing in 1932. And he photographed even up until in the last month before he passed away. And I would guess, I don't know how many negatives there are in the house with his son and grandson, but maybe 8 lakhs or something. So, of all kinds of different subjects. Nationalist figures. He photographed for the Baroda royal family, several other Gujarati royal smaller princely estates. He did nature photographs. He took photographs of religious pilgrimage sites. A lot of photographs of Ahmedabad, just the city as it was developing. So there's a range of work that could be done. And his studio is still just near the Ellis Bridge. And his grandson has still got that space. So now there are 3 generations of photographers.
What do you think intrigued him to take these pictures? Like the very first day that he went out and he saw these women working. What do you think that did he start it as a hobby? Like, I just want to capture women at work, or he wanted to show the world the working class of Ahmedabad, particularly women, the working class of women.
Primary school teachers today, what do you think about their salaries? Not very remunerative work, right? That job in 1937 also did not pay very well. So he became interested in photography by accidentally taking an art class. And that happened to be, he didn't go in search of photography, it sort of happened to him. I think if it had been painting that was offered, he would have studied painting instead. After he took up photography, he was looking for opportunities to photograph whenever he could. It was extremely expensive, about ₹1 a photograph for him. So at that time, when he was maybe making 15 or 16 rupees per month, this is a very expensive hobby for a young man to have. So when he was approached by the Jyoti Sangh, would you please take these photographs? For him, this was a way not just of getting paid for photography, but also, you know, he didn't have to then rely upon his regular salary to support his developing interest. And the subject was defined, as I said, just by the Jyoti Sangh itself. They determined the commission, and he went out and kind of embraced that in the way that he understood it, which is through people he knew. in the city.
Fascinating talk and an admirer of your work. No, I have a question which I'd like you to think very imaginatively or intuitively. I was wondering, what if you had chanced upon this whole history and this photographic corpus without any knowledge of the photographer? I mean, I'm just wondering, because you have also made this distinction in the beginning of your lecture between amateur photographers who are rather understudied, in comparison with the other kinds that you drew attention to. So how does the reading of these photographs change if we eliminate Pranlal Patel and his imagination and his rendering of his photographs? How does the historical research and your reading change? I'm just curious, because this comes from my own understanding that we also chance upon many historical photographs. We don't know what the photographers, who the photographers were and why did they photograph them at times. So, I mean, I'm thinking about your presentation more from the point of view of how do we look at historical material and the photograph as an historical artifact. I don't know, I'm just curious.
The photograph as a historical source, in some ways, is no different than any other historical source I might deal with, right? There's a question of, there are certain questions you ask. Who created it, and so forth, right? Where did it come from? How is it still in existence, right? Because historians, we are left with whatever remains to work with. So there's certain kinds of questions that are the same. When I started looking at his photographs, I did a lot of study of what was published about Indian photography in that period. And so I was looking at portraiture. I mentioned portraiture as his main technique. Okay, so how did the professional photographers take photographs? How did they create, a setting for those who they photographed? And there's a really big difference. I think if you think to other studio photography, even the ones that have backdrops, they're quite different. So I think this question about what you're seeing poverty or you're seeing just ordinary life, there isn't an attempt to romanticize or to valorize the subject exactly. I found it really interesting, the angle. So when I compared his photographs of different kinds of work to the ethnographic photography of the colonial state, there's almost a way in which those subjects are depicted without any context. So it's a decontextualization of the subject that renders them a type. And he's really careful not to do this. And there's so many other photographs, I could have shown you, but one of the strategies that he regularly used was framing on the side of an image, so that we see a child or just another person, just part of them. So that contextualization means that the subject is part of a community, is part of a broader society, is not just a type. Maybe that's their child, or in fact we saw some photographs where there are women with their children. So they can't be diminished to just being a worker of that kind. So I think if you want to use photography, even if you don't know who the photographer was, pay attention to the kind of photography it is, and then I would recommend juxtaposing the photographs that you find with those studies that we do have already. And there's now a pretty good body of literature on Indian photography.
Slightly tangential question along the lines of the conversation that you were just having. One of the thoughts that kept crossing my mind throughout this was that how historical photographs right now are so much beyond just documentation, merely in the sense that they're so less in number. But right now we see that there's a lot of photography happening day to day. So you also talked about photography and its importance as inscriptions. What do you think that means for the future of, well, his photography and its, the importance of historical inscriptions, say 70 years from now?
Anthropologist by training is quite innovative, and I think if he were answering your question, historian has a hard time in some ways thinking about the question in the contemporary world. I think one of the things that he would say is that your generation, specifically, lives in a very different visual world, right, than this generation. And the problem is almost the reverse, perhaps, for future historians who want to document the period after, 2010, because in this period, we're scraping to find images. I am myself about to clear out family photographs of about 50 years from my parents' home. I can't keep them all. They will be lost. But in your generation, the problem will reverse, because the problem may be that there are so many images that it's very hard to get a grip on what it is you're looking at. And just thinking about social media. So again, this is a wonderful question, and I think probably a historian is not the best person to ask. But I think that an anthropologist would be a really good person to ask that question, or a sociologist who's working in contemporary society, because those scholars, their methods kind of lend themselves to the kind of question that you're raising.
Taken 8 lakh pictures. So did he do any other similar project like he's done for Jyoti Sangh? That's one question. Second is, we can see like there are more pictures in the presentation. Can we still see those pictures also?
He did. I haven't seen another series like this, but as I said earlier, he took a lot of photographs, kind of street photography shots of Ahmedabad. And some of the ones that come, there's a whole series of young boys, fishermen, who are throwing nets out into the river. So similar kind of class background as his subjects in this series. There are other photographs just of, city markets, or he took a lot of photographs of the city walls. Some of you may be aware that Ahmedabad's city walls were almost entirely taken down before it was stopped. And so some of the city walls, he was photographing in areas of the city where the city wall had been removed and the community is kind of reconstituting. So you have photographs also of places around the major gates of the city. In terms of seeing other, I can show you some of the other photographs.
Why did you take this project, and when did you came across this photographer? So why did you take this project, and when did you come across this photographer?
I was in India on sabbatical, and I was looking for materials on working class women. Textile mill laborers specifically, as I have been pursuing a comparative project on women in the Bombay Presidency and in Lancashire in the first half of the 20th century. I knew Pranlal Patel since the mid-90s when I met him while I was doing my dissertation research. So I thought he's pretty much the only person I could think of who was taking photographs in that period. And as I recounted, when I asked him for photographs, he didn't think he had any, but then he sort of thought women work, and he started pulling these out. So as soon as I saw the photographs, given that he was about 101 at that point in time, I decided I needed to shelve the other work that I was doing on Manchester and Lancashire and even women industrial textile workers, and I needed to just focus on presenting this work. So I guess 2011 is when I first found them, and then I worked on them very intensively through the exhibition, which was in 2014. And then I have turned back to women industrial textile workers, and this subject I'm still thinking about. There could be a book here, but I haven't really decided if that's the case.
now we have instant cameras, and then we see all these sort of things somebody can take. How did he manage to take photographs which look as if they're instant?
I have a camera. I included it in the exhibition so people could actually see it, because most of our students don't know what a photographic negative is and have not seen this kind of camera. But he was able to purchase this camera through a kind of a lend and lease program with a store, where he was giving them money on an installation. The photography club was critical because the photography club was comprised of some men of significant wealth. There was a retired colonel from the Indian Army who was one of the leaders of this group. And so they were providing essentially the darkroom space and the chemicals necessary. But he had to buy paper and he had to buy film.
He seemed to be taking the photograph
Yes.
like on the spot, like this.
That's what he was doing. That's exactly what he was doing. He would sling it around his, head, over his shoulder. He would get on his bicycle. He would race off into the city, find a subject, engage the subject, and in most cases, he took the photograph on the spot. So it's an early street photography, a case of early street photography for sure. I don't think he was alone in India. I think there were other Indian photographers who were doing this, but they were mainly amateurs in this period.
Presentation. It's interesting to see how photographs can also be sources of history. My question is their understanding of the term work. This is all about where somebody is getting paid for it. So both Jyoti Sangh, the organization, as well as the photographer, are taking images of people who are getting paid. But the truth is that the women are doing a lot of other work. So has he taken any photographs of the other work done by the women? And secondly, this was paid for. But later on, did he take on his own without anybody asking him to do this?
Along the lines that you're asking, but he left his job eventually as a primary school teacher. He became well known enough in the city that some of these smaller princely states were inviting him to take photographs of their weddings or, particular ritual occasions in the family. And eventually he was making so much money as a photographer that it just didn't make sense, and he was pretty bored, frankly, as a primary school teacher. So he then did start taking photographs for his own pleasure. And some of the photographs I just mentioned in answer to this other question, the boys who are fishing, those were he took thousands of photographs for his own pleasure, but he had a studio also. He established a studio, people would come, they would have very formal portraits taken. By that point in time, by the late 1940s, he kind of knew what he was doing, so he was able to work commercially, but also for his own pleasure and edification. Now you asked another question.
Working women,
working.
Photographs of working women, of his understanding of the word work.
I haven't really seen. I think we pulled out all the photographs that he took of working women. There may be working women who are ancillary to the images he took of the city, but I don't think he ever took up that cause again. And that's what I mean by he didn't think of himself as a feminist. This wasn't a political project for him. I think at the time it was really a way to feed his own hobby. Yeah, and pleasure are lined up. So you see the last photographs he took were in color. He moved into color photography, I think, in the late 1970s, early 80s. So by that point in time, he was very much up to date with the latest technological advances in photography. And his grandson, actually, part of the family business is now kind of in medical photography during surgeries. So they're a pretty advanced, technologically, they're a pretty advanced group, not just studio photography.
That after 2010, with the social media and the kind of photography and things are happening. So isn't that also a similar thing when she said about working women and what is work? This is a very modern day sensibility of the concept of a working woman. So that would not have applied in, say, 100 years, at least 80, 70, 80 years back. Wouldn't that be?
Yes, what I would say is that if you are from an elite family 150 years ago and you're a woman, you might not work outside the home. But if you are from a non-elite family, let's say you're the wife of a peasant, you are working in the fields outside the home, right? Always. So I think that conception of work is not just entirely modern. I mean, he did take photographs of the typewriters and the telephone operators, and those were new professions for women. He also took, this is in answer to an earlier question, he did take a lot of photographs. About half of the photographs taken, between a third and a half of the working women, were in a domestic environment. So sometimes he did go into women's homes, and how he did that, I'm not entirely certain. We saw one photograph of two girls who were stitching alongside their mother and, I don't know, embroidering, yes. So he did sometimes go in. There are some other photographs of women in the kitchen, a woman in her kitchen. So he's also acknowledging, there's a picture of a woman who is, there's like buttermilk churning, there's a woman who is washing clothing. It's not clear that if she's washing her own clothing or somebody else's. So there are photographs of that kind of domestic labor also.
You got a chance to interact with 11 daughters?
I did have the opportunity to interact with Ilaben, but over a very long period of time, because she was known to one of my uncles, who was also a labor organizer. And it was greatly saddened by her passing. But she really, for me, is a heroine in a couple of ways in this story, as you will have seen, because she was leading such an important movement for women's labor rights, but also enabling these Seva women to see themselves as connected to women long before them, right? So it wasn't like they were just new citizens, they were connected to these other citizens of an earlier era. No, she passed away in the early 1970s. And Suyaben Sarabhai, any student looking for a great topic, if you read Gujarati, I would recommend. She is a fabulous figure to study. So if you go to Ahmedabad, you can visit this house that was the Sarabhai's house, and there's a permanent exhibition called Motaben, which is about her work. I think Gandhiji gets a lot of credit for labor organizing in Ahmedabad, but probably duly she should get that credit. Which was a new institution. So we also have a sense of women who are migrating to the cities from other places. Night soil collection. This is a photograph that I believe was staged. It's the only one. So usually he was taking photographs on the spot, but if you know anything about block printing, that block doesn't really make sense in the position that it's in. So this is the only photograph of the 118 or so that I think was staged. So he must have wanted a block printer photograph, or maybe the Jyoti Sangh specifically wanted it. I don't know. Here's this woman I spoke about. Sometimes when I look at the photographs, I imagine the sound, of making those brooms. Must have been there. here's a kitchen. Domestic environment. Water pots. So whether or not the Jyoti Sangh thought of that as work, I don't know, but he did. That much we can be sure. She's almost looking at him, but not quite, right? I didn't choose a lot of the images that are of this kind, where you see knife sharpening or snack sellers, and I think in my other this is a good look at another marketplace.
What is she selling?
She's selling sticks of neem for brushing her teeth. Yeah. But again, with her child, this is what I mean by the framing. So if you were just looking at a type of labor, I think you wouldn't have this whole context. And this is another framing. You know, he's purposefully caught the child, and there's even somebody's elbow in the corner. Sangh's early projects was to help women who were being domestically assaulted. And and young women in Ahmedabad are relatively free to move around, even in this period. So, you know, today, or even in the 80s or 90s, you would see college girls on scooters going here and there at, you know, 10 o'clock at night. Nobody really looks otherwise at them. But I think it was really interesting that these young women were being trained in self-defense. And sometimes it's because they were going into polls, into family areas where there was a domestic dispute, and they might have to, you know, defend a woman or themselves if they're going to remove that woman. The Jyoti Sangh maintained a kind of a hostel for women who could be, you know, could stay there and get away from their abuser. That's one of the great things that they were engaged in very early on. So many great projects.
May I request Mrs. Palaporia to please give Dr. Trivedi a small token of our appreciation. Research Center and the Asiatic Society, I would like to thank Dr. Lisa Trivedi for a very interesting lecture on invisible subjects. I think that though change is constant, yet nothing has really changed a lot for these women, you see. Also like to thank the management of Sophia College for being our collaborators, the professors and students of Sophia College and Wilson College, and the audience for attending this lecture. So thank you all, and drive home safe.